Okay, so my name's Debbie, and I wish to explore the sexual imperial legacy of the United States military, or even like local police forces, and the wounds that their policing leaves on the people that they exploit. I tried to tie this project into a bigger picture to look at similarities in the disposability of black, brown, and yellow femme bodies, to think about the solidarity we can find in our shared trauma. I've been reading a lot about different literature on interracial sexual violence and realized that if all of us racially marginalized folks could clearly recognize the parallels between, say, the trials faced by Korean Camptown women from the 1950s onward, and then like the culture of sexual violence against black women that precipitated the civil rights movement, then it would be easier to love one another and to work together towards shared goals. So here's what I think. I think that us racialized bodies, although separated by oceans and culture, we occupy similar vulnerability niches in our societies. This is a story about how we don't matter in many of the same ways because we're deemed invaluable by many of the same structures. I'll show how we are both victims of structural, state sanctioned gendered violence, which we physically and psychologically experience in similar ways. After, I'll point to means we find agency and strength to fight back regardless of this positioning. And lastly, I'll emphasize how the world is desperate to erase our accomplishments and diminish our worth with our collective memory and understanding of history. Part 1. Violence. Historically, the South Korean government has avoided prosecuting U.S. soldiers accused of crimes against its own people. South Korean women have been the target of most crimes committed by U.S. soldiers. Moon writes, U.S. military authorities occupying Korea after the war took over some of the comfort stations operated by Japanese military forces since the 19th century. During its conquest of territory across East Asia, the Japanese military forced hundreds of thousands of women from Korea, China, Okinawa, and rural Japan and other parts of Asia into sexual slavery. With the assistance of Korean officials, U.S. authorities continued the system absent formal slavery, but under conditions with limited choices for women involved. Lee writes, although some women were unwillingly forced into prostitution in these camp towns or induced to do it by deceit, others could not help deciding for themselves to work in camp towns in order to survive. A former campground worker recalls, I have to do what I have to do to eat, right? I was hungry, and I went there for a while in the end. And what do you do once you're there? Got no choice, so started life there. Camp towns were lucrative for South Korea as a whole. U.S. military men were eager to spend their money in these towns for sexual services. Overall, U.S. troops contributed 25% of South Korea's gross national product in the 1960s. Camp towns and prostitution thus became critical parts of a South Korean economy struggling to emerge from the devastation of war. Here are some other quotes by former military sex workers. Women like me were the biggest sacrifice for my country's alliance with Americans, she says. Looking back, I think my body was not mine, but the government's and the U.S. military's. An anonymous former military sex worker blamed the Korean government by stating, my country pimped me to U.S. soldiers. The Korean government organized weekly checkups, and not showing up to them meant being locked up at a separate medical facility for days. I was forced to get weekly checkups with painful treatments for sexually transmitted diseases. J.J. Kim describes her relationship with her pimp as a slave owner and a slave. When she brought a soldier to her room, she was not allowed to spend more than 15 minutes with him. After she finished her service, her pimp sent her to a different club without a break in between, even for snacks. These testaments reveal that pimps solely viewed the women as lucrative commodities to be sold to American GIs. Korean men lost control over their women's bodies to American men who already threatened their manhood by fighting against the communist enemy on their behalf. While the Korean government agents acknowledged the vital roles the military sex workers played in contributing to its national interests, they expressed feelings of anxiety and incompetence as men by calling the women derogatory names. By disparaging these women who challenged Korean manhood and patriarchy, Korean men sought to reformulate their masculinity and regain a sense of virility. Black women. Without an appreciation for the particular predicaments of black women in Jim Crow South, McGuire says that it's nearly impossible to understand why thousands of working class and hundreds of middle class black women chose to walk rather than ride the bus for 381 days. So as some background. During the 1940s, reports of sexual violence directed at black women flooded into local and national NAACP chapters. The stories follow similar patterns. In May 1942, Sadie Mae Gibson, a 23-year-old black school teacher in Decatur, Alabama, was walking home one sunny afternoon when Dan Ollinger, a white teenager, forced her into a clump of bushes and rifle point raped her. 2 months later, as Rosalie Cherry, a black high school student, walked home from church in Little Rock, Arkansas, 3 uniformed police officers threatened to throw her in jail unless she got in the patrol car. They drove her behind a railroad embankment and sexually molested her. She escaped after promising to get them another girl. So, African American women constantly complained about the atrocious treatment that they receive from white men in general, but specifically on buses. Aside from direct sexual harassment, drivers referred to black women with contemptuous names like black N-words, black bitches, heifers, and whores. Dulca Perkins remembered a driver who regularly referred to her as an ugly black ape. In addition to slinging insults, McGuire continues on page 73, bus drivers often slapped black women who crossed them. They refused to stop at every corner in black neighborhoods, allowed white children to board before adults, demanded blacks give up their seats for whites, and forced them to pay their fare at the front of the bus, then answer through the rear. So verbal, physical, and sexual abuse maintained the racial hierarchy on buses oftentimes. There were at least 30 complaints by African Americans in Montgomery in 1953, indicating a growing sense of impatience with the grim conditions on city buses. Most of these complaints came from working-class black women who made up the bulk of Montgomery City Line's riders, over half of whom toiled as domestics. With the median salary of just $523 per year, domestics could not afford automobiles and had no choice but to ride the city buses to and from the white homes in which they worked. While domestics could and often did resist sexual harassment and abuse on the job by quitting, they could not easily find other transportation. Violence. A poem. Interracial sexual violence. Interracial sexual violence. Interracial sexual violence. My body belongs to anyone and everyone who wishes to claim it, because evidently it does not belong to me. I am Korean. I am black. I am neither. I am both. It doesn't matter. My tender skin, soft, full lips, kind heart is always understood as a vessel for brutality. I would like to recognize that I am more than what I am subjected to. But do you even know what I'm subjected to? Your government, your local police force, your son in the military, alongside all of the military exec. I am a patriot that you do not wish to hear or see but to use. I am a soldier in a war I do not want to fight. There is a battle happening between me and my country every time I am defiled. State-sanctioned sexual violence, the empire needs you and needs you urgently. He does not know how to govern this nation alone. I am to be bought and sold and bargained, but I refuse to be a mere object on which things happen. I am a patriot that you do not wish to see or hear, but I still may speak. I crisscross back and forth over this planet, convinced there is compassion hidden in the territory. I add obscenities to your anthem when I sing it. You need to write a new one and dedicate it to me. Name it Apologies. Students across the nation will recite it every morning until I feel compensated. I am more than a site for violence, more than a hole to be fucked. I am more than a site for violence, more than a hole to be fucked. Part 2. Resistance. Black resistance. When Jo Ann Robinson heard that Rosa Parks had been arrested, she didn't wait for approval to launch a boycott. The flyers announced the boycott, promoting it as an effort to protect black womanhood. It reads, another Negro woman has been arrested and thrown in jail because she refused to get up out of her seat on the bus for a white person to sit down. It is the second time since the Claudette Colvin case that a Negro woman has been arrested for the same thing. This has to be stopped. Negroes have rights too, for if Negroes did not ride buses, they could not operate. 3/4 of the riders are Negroes, yet we are arrested or have to stand up over empty seats. If we do not do something to stop these arrests, they will continue. The next time, it may be you, or your daughter or mother. This woman's case will come up on Monday. We are therefore asking every Negro to stay off the buses Monday in protest of the arrest and trial. Don't ride the buses to work, to town, to school, or anywhere on Monday. Please stay off all buses Monday. In the early morning hours, Robinson called her foot soldiers and the Women's Political Council and told them it was time for their long-planned protest. I'll crawl on my knees before I get back on them buses, one woman said while waiting at a carpool dispatch center. Her friend agreed. I ain't about to get on them buses. I'll walk 20 miles before I ride 'em. Irene Stovall, a mother and domestic servant, told Lee that she was never going back on them old buses. because the driver sexually harassed her. "They say nasty things and they talk under folks' clothes," Stovall said. "They ain't getting no more of my dimes." Korean resistance. These excerpts are from the Korea Times, a publication centered in South Korea. August 11th, 1971. More than 100 persons, mostly women, demonstrated Friday afternoon outside the gate of Camp Ames near here in protest against the death of Korean woman, who was reportedly murdered by a U.S. soldier, police said. Police said the woman, identified as Miss Kim Hun-suk, 23, was found dead in her home early Friday morning. She spent the night with the soldier. May 15th, 1969, in Pupyeong, Gyeonggi-do. More than 300 quote-unquote prostitutes, whose customers are mainly U.S. military servicemen, staged a protest funeral march here in front of the 8057 American unit, demanding that Sergeant Tenney appear before them. They charged the American responsible for the death of one of their friends called Miss Liu Unja. The 23-year-old girlfriend of the American allegedly killed herself Monday morning after he brutally beat her. The hearse, carrying girls in white morning dresses, stopped in front of the unit's front door en route to the burial site and shouted, "Come out, Temmie. Let him appear before us." Resistance. A poem. Resist that you are powerless. Resist that you must be a passive recipient of structural gendered violence. Let us build homes in one another and forge coalitions inside each other that need not be sanctioned by any state. If Negroes did not ride buses, they couldn't operate. If Korean Camptown women did not ride U.S. military men, the South Korean economy could not operate. Even in our lowest place, in the darkest shadows cast on us, we are vital to your survival. Resist that you are powerless. Resist that you must be a passive recipient of structural gendered violence. Let us build homes in one another and forge coalitions with one another that need not be sanctioned by any state. Please stay off of all buses Monday. Come out, Temmie. Let him appear before us. More than 300 warriors of the Camptown demand that you stay off all buses Monday. I'll crawl on my knees for I let them U.S. soldiers get away with the murder of one of my Camptown sisters. The Camptown woman got beat to death by white men in the Jim Crow South, and they still stood their ground outside of one's 8057 American unit. Resist that you are powerless. Resist that you must be a passive recipient of structural gendered violence. Let us build homes in one another and forge coalitions inside each other that need not be sanctioned by any state. Part 3. Memory. Bruce Cummings, The Korean War, Chapter 3. The Party of Forgetting. Memory comes down to us through sedimented layers of previous apprehension and interpretation. People experience history, lodge it in memory, and then rewrite it to suit their needs, particularly where individual complicity in crimes is at stake. This plastic power preserves psychic peace at the cost of repression. Black women. Like Judge Carter, the national newspaper and magazines reporters waiting outside of the Rosa Parks ruling ignored the black woman's testimonies that detailed decades of mistreatment and denied King's leadership in the boycott. Instead, the media turned King into an apostle of civil rights. It was not just Rosa Parks, the radical activist, who was written out of the story of the Montgomery bus boycott. Joanne Robinson and her army of women and the Women's Political Council, as well as the thousands of working-class women who made Montgomery the walking city, were reduced to footnotes in history. Korean women. In general, Moon says the Korean people do not want to be reminded of the Korean War or its consequences. Such devastating memories may signify national insecurity and a continued vulnerable position to people. It is an unbearable national dishonor for many Koreans that the sexual domination of a number of Korean women by Yankee, who are American people, including soldiers, should be tolerated for the sake of national security. Moreover, women in the U.S. Camptown stand as a symbol of Korea's dependency on the USA, an ongoing colonized condition, serving as quote-unquote living testaments of national destruction, poverty, and insecurity. Therefore, the presence of these women has been seen as a social, national, and historical disgrace, as well as a quote-unquote necessary evil. Memory. A poem. Why don't you remember me? I scream. I'm dreaming, but the sun on my back and the gravity keeping me nailed to this pavement tell me I'm wide awake. Why don't you remember me? I shout again. To no one in particular. This church parking lot is empty, and the church building refuses to respond to me. He's stubborn. It's easier for him to pretend I am not here. He won't let me inside, where the 11 a.m. service has just commenced. Why don't you remember me? He sighs, breaking the tired silence. He answers, because I don't want to. Memory comes down to us through the colander of men in power, whose holes are too small to let our brown, black, and yellow bodies through. Your history books are filled to the brim with everything but us. We resist and we exist, but for how long? How long will they remember us for? How long will we have to prove our worth for? How long? If men with power rewrite history to suit our needs, is that not a clearly violent assertion that we are expendable? Our tree bodies, our strong roots, the oxygen and stability we give you, you could not breathe if we did not decide so. And still, you do not remember me. Why don't you remember me?